Let's look at the word on this morning. We're going to look at Acts 22, verses 1 through 5. Acts 22, verses 1 through 5. All right, let's look at it. It says, Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence, and he saith, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Sicily, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. As also the high priest doeth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. Amen. If you're taking notes on today, Grace Center, I am coming from the topic, I've got a story to tell. I've got a story to tell. Grace Center, every believer has a story. We all have stories. What we used to do, where we used to go, and who we used to do it with. We all have a story. Therefore, we all have a once upon a time. A time when God was not at the forefront of our minds. Coming to church, watching church virtual services was not a priority. No, we had other priorities and things that captured our attention. We had other things to focus on. You weren't concerned about prayer. You weren't concerned about praise and worship. You weren't concerned about the fruit of the Spirit. You didn't care about the faith of Abraham. You didn't care about the rod of Moses. You didn't care about the walls of Jericho falling down. The 3 Hebrew boys being in a fiery furnace didn't even faze you. You did not believe that a man could be swallowed by a fish. You didn't believe that someone could survive being encamped by lions and not be killed. You did not believe that thousands could be fed by 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. You did not believe that a man could walk on water, turn water into wine, and raise dead folks from the grave. There are some folks that did not believe any of that. As a matter of fact, at some point, you may have even questioned the rapture. A time when Jesus Christ is coming back for the church, his people, where we will meet him in the air. But now, since you have had a conversion experience, you now believe. Yeah. Since you have been converted, you now believe. You believe in Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. And you believe it because you have had that spiritual conversion. And now that you have had that conversion, you can look at folks in their eye, and now you can say, oh, once upon a time. Well, Grace Center, you're not alone, because that gospel globetrotter, that man, that former Pharisee, the man named Paul, he also had a once upon a time story as well. Grace, you see, it's okay to give testimonies. It's okay to tell others what God has done in our lives. As a matter of fact, the Bible even gives us permission to do so. Psalms 22 and 22, it says, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. Psalm 71 and 15, it says, my mouth shall show forth thy righteousness and thy salvation all the day, for I know not the numbers thereof. Psalm 66 and 16, it says, come and hear, all you that fear God, and I will declare what he hath done for my soul. The Bible makes it clear that it's okay, Grace Center, to give testimonies. It is okay to give testimonies. Now, I am sure that we have all heard people testify and give an account to what they have seen or heard, and from the jump street, we know that they were not credible. Yep, they could be in your family. They could be in my family. They could be your neighbors, your co-workers. They are people who we all know that sometimes they don't testify, but they'll sometimes test a lie. But let's look at someone here in the text, Grace Center, who testified and gave a testimony that we all can believe in. Let's look at it. Beginning in verse number 1 of Acts 22, Grace Center, Luke, who is the author of Acts, he gives us the testimony of Paul. All right, he gives us the testimony of Paul. And Grace Center, Paul was serious about the gospel. He was serious about the gospel, and he was indeed a credible witness. Because how many of us would go from town to town telling others about something, and we tell others, but our life could be on the line? He would go from town to town. Life is on the line, but he is telling others what God has done for him. How many of us would die for something that we did not believe? But here you have Paul giving a testimony, placing his life on the line. So we know that we can trust Paul, because not many people would put their life in danger to test a lie. But here Paul is going from place to place, witnessing and testifying. And we know that he's a credible witness, because not many people will put their life in danger for this. Long story short here, Paul, he makes his way to Jerusalem. Once they get to Jerusalem, certain people notice that Paul, and since Paul was teaching things against the law, people got upset with him. Watch this, Grace Center. They grabbed Paul out of the temple, beating him, trying to kill him. As the people are trying to kill Paul, word gets back to the commander, the person in charge. The commander, he comes with his soldiers and he breaks up the fight. When the soldiers take Paul away, the crowd was violent. It was so violent that the soldiers had to place Paul on their shoulders so the people could not reach Paul and get to him. As they get into the building, Paul asks for the commander's permission to speak to the people. the commander gives him permission to speak to the people, which leads us to Acts 22, verse number 1. In other words, here we see Paul, he begins to give us his testimony. So here you have Paul in front of this angry crowd, this violent crowd. They just finished trying to kill him. But Paul is so confident in God that he's willing to share his testimony. Now, if Paul can share his story among a violent crowd, why are so many believers afraid to share their story at all? I mean, these people were trying to take his life, and Paul knew that this was all going to take place because it was prophesied that this would happen. But despite what he saw and despite what he heard, he began to testify anyway. This is testifying, Grace Center, on a whole different level. Acts 22 verses 1 and 2, it says, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you." And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silent, and he saith. Okay, watch this. I do not want you to miss what's happening here in the text. It says that when Paul began to address them, he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue. In other words, he began to speak to them in a language which they could understand. Grace Center, when you give a testimony, speak so the people can understand you. You can have more degrees than a thermometer, but when you're giving a testimony, when you're sharing your story, speak so the people can understand you. Because if they cannot understand you, what you're saying to them, you may not be able to relate to them. Verse 3, let's look at it. Verse 3, it says again, "I am verily a man, which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Sicily, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day." Grace Center, when you give a testimony, if your audience don't know you, it's important to tell them who you are. The men in the text really don't know Paul. They heard of him, but they really don't know him. Therefore, Paul, he begins by telling them who he is and where he's from. He tells them how he was even taught and who he was taught by, because that's one of the issues the people had with him. And Paul did something very interesting while giving his testimony, Grace Center, and I don't want you to miss this. Watch this. Paul said, "I was zealous towards God just like you all are." In other words, I understand you. I understand you. I can relate to you. You may think that I don't and I cannot relate, but trust me, I can. He said, "I was zealous toward God just like you all are." He's relating to the people. He's trying to get them to come to some sense of agreement with one another. But let's continue to read on here. Paul then says in verse number 4, "And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women." In some of your Bibles, when Paul is talking about, and when he says the word way, because Paul was persecuted, it said, "And I was persecuted this way." That word way, watch this, is another name for Christians. It's another name for Christians. Look at it. Verse number 4 again. It says, and I persecuted this way unto the death. Way is another name for Christians, another name for believers. Okay? And we as believers, we all know the way is Jesus Christ. So here in the testimony, Paul tells the people about his past. He tells them how he was one of the ringleaders in persecuting the church. He laid it all out on the line when he didn't even have to. But yet he did it anyway. But let me say this right here, Grace Center. Watch this. When you testify, be careful of what you testify about. Everyone cannot handle your entire testimony. In other words, watch this. Use wisdom in what you share and who you share it with. Let me say that one more time. When you are giving your testimony, use wisdom in what you share and who you share it with. Paul, in his testimony, he saw fit to share a part of his past that would allow his audience to understand him a little better. Watch this. If you have to think twice about sharing your testimonies with others, you may want to rethink about what you need to share. And we all have been there. You know, we've all heard people give their testimonies. And we'll sometimes scratch our heads and we're like, I cannot believe you're sharing this in public. I cannot believe you went into so much detail about your past. I cannot believe you told us all of that. Sometimes it's just TMI. It's just too much information. Be careful, Grace Center. Use wisdom when you give a testimony and when you share what you have to share with others. Paul continues in verse number 5, and he says, as also the high priest doeth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. So Paul is saying that that the high priest as well and the elders can vouch for me. In other words, he's confident. He's saying, look, y'all, my testimony is true. I have people that can back up everything that I'm telling you. And Grace Center, when you testify, make sure it's the truth. Don't fabricate a testimony. Don't exaggerate a testimony. Biblical scholar Mark Twain, he says this: the difference between a person who tells the truth and tells a lie is that the liars got to have a better memory. Grace Center, don't lie when you're giving a testimony. Tell it like it is for the benefit of the person who is hearing your testimony. You are trying to exhort and uplift others by your testimony. You are telling others how God kept you and your family, how God provided for you when your ends could not meet, how God miraculously healed you or someone that you knew. But if you lie about it, and if it gets out that you lied about your testimony, if that person is not a seasoned Christian, their faith could be rocked. All because you decided to fabricate or exaggerate on a testimony. Paul was like, my testimony is true. As a matter of fact, you don't believe me, you can go see the elders, you can see everybody, you can see the chief priests, and they can tell you right now that what I am telling you is the truth. Now, Grace Center, you can continue to read the rest of Paul's testimony as he describes his Damascus Road experience. Watch this. Something that I notice here about Paul's testimony is very interesting. When you look at Paul testifying here in the text, you will see something that is interesting. What you will see is that not everyone is encouraged by his testimony. As a matter of fact, when you look at it, no one is encouraged by Paul's testimony, which is interesting because testimonies are supposed to inspire you and encourage you. But no one was encouraged by his testimony here in the text. But this is what happened, Grace Center. Watch this. The heart of these people were already set against Paul, and they were not interested in anything that he had to say. Okay? Their hearts were already set against him. They didn't care what Paul had to say. As a matter of fact, as Paul is giving his testimony, he spake of another incident where Jesus himself said not everyone will receive his testimony. Watch this now. Acts 22:18. Watch this. And saw him saying unto me, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem. Watch this. For they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. Testimonies are to encourage and glorify Jesus. But not everyone will be interested in what you have to say. Because after Paul's testimony, the men, they still wanted to kill Paul. As a matter of fact, 40 of them conspired and they plotted and they planned together to still kill Paul. They even made an oath to one another, and they said that none of us are going to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. So not everyone will receive your testimony. But Grace Center, what you need to do in that situation is testify anyway. Some will tune you out, but testify anyway. Some will walk out in the middle of your testimony, but continue to testify anyway. Some will yarn and go to sleep on you, but testify anyway. And I'm so glad that Paul kept testifying, because who knows that his testimony, it may not have been for them. Watch this. It could have been for the benefit of us today. Yeah, it may not have been for them, but it could have been for the benefit of us today, reading his story, reading his testimony, and being encouraged by what he had to say. Because when I look at the courage of Paul and the adversity that he went through, he still stood bold and testified about how God brought him through. In Grace Center, we all have a story. The question is, what is your story? What has God done for you? What did he bring you through? How did you make it over? How did you keep your head up? Testimonies are important. Testimonies are needed. Who knows that your story, your testimony just may help somebody make it through the day. Your testimony may help someone hang on until help comes their way. As a matter of fact, when you yourself are having a bad day and things are not going your way, I give you complete permission to have a flashback and remember how God has brought you through, how you made it through rough patches of your life, how when things gets a little bit rough, you might have to encourage yourself and give your own self a testimony about what God has done for you. Watch this, watch this. By you giving a testimony, all right, by you encouraging others, all right, you can help others get through difficult times in their lives. Sometimes you may not even know who your testimony may be for. But when you give a testimony, when you tell others about the goodness of the Lord and what he has done for you, what he has done for your family, how he has made a way, as the old saints would say, out of no way. When there was no way possible, it was impossible for this to happen, for that door to be open, for your body to be healed, for you to open up that business, for you to get that loan, for you to move into that neighborhood. When you give a testimony, when you begin to tell others about the goodness of the Lord, you have no idea who you may be encouraging, because someone can be listening to you and say, you know what? What you're telling me is the same thing that I'm going through right now. So that gives me the strength. It helps me out in my situation to know that if you went through it, I can get through it as well. Oh, you have no idea, Grace Center, who you may be encouraging when you are giving a testimony. And something that I've learned over the years, Grace Center, is that every once in a while, not all of the time, you go through to get to. Let me say that again. Sometimes you go through to get to. And sometimes you cannot get to unless you go through. Sometimes we have to go through something to get to something. But sometimes you may not be able to get to something unless you go through something. But when we go through something, we're able to get to what we need to get to by the goodness and the favor of the Lord. We all have a testimony. We all have been through some things in our lives. And if you have been through anything in your life, it may be good for you to share your testimony. Oh, we all have a testimony experience. We all have a once upon a time. But the question is, are you going to tell your story? Are you going to share your testimony with others? We all have a story to tell. You're at the place of where you're at, not by happenstance, but many of us are where we're at by the hand of the Lord. And we know exactly what we went through to get to the place of where we're at today. It hasn't always been easy to get to where you're at, but because God saw fit to place you there, you can share your testimonies with others. There's a phrase that says, there's a story behind my glory. You see, sometimes people will see the glory, but they don't understand the story. They don't understand everything you had to go through. They don't understand the headaches. They don't understand the fights. They don't understand the ups and the downs, the twists and the turns. But you do. And if you can tell others about how you made it out, how you were able to get over, When you share your testimony with others, you can encourage them. They may put down the wine bottle. They may put down the drugs. May put down different things that they are addicted to. All because you decided to share your testimony, to share your story. Paul gave his story. He shared his testimony. And although the people in this story, in this particular text, although their hearts were set against Paul and they did not want to hear what he was telling them, you still need to share your story anyway, because his story is benefiting us today, who's looking back on it and saying, you know what, if Paul can do what he did in the face of adversity, I can tell others about what God has done for me. Grace Center, I encourage you today to share your story with others, to share your testimony with others, because you have no idea the lives you may be changing and impacting because you decided to tell your story.